is really understanding how quickly are things getting to the quote stage, and then how quickly are they moving? Because what you may find out is that things are sitting in the pipeline too long because the lack of understanding of how to drive them forward.
Hey, MMT followers, Christina Fugis with MoldMaking Technology, and I'm back for another quick MMT chat. Today, my guest is Keith Bradt, who is the owner and business development director of Kallan Sales Development. And he's here to provide a mix of insight, some practical advice, and a little personal perspective on the role of sales in a mold shop. So, hi, Keith.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
All right. So first, why don't you talk a little bit about yourself and how did you fall into this focus on mold making?
So really, a lot of my background has been specifically in the industry of mold making, plastic injection molding in various sales leadership roles over the course of time. Really kind of began my career more on the applications engineering side of it. And really, as I started to kind of hone into the sales development roles, really what was the premise of founding Callan was to be able to really help organizations be better at what they do and grow revenue scalably based on that versus just being a contributor. Whereas if I'm one salesperson out of five, I can hit my number all the time. But if the other four aren't, how do you create a scalable process that allows everybody to thrive to ultimately bring up the business?
I love it. I like that you can speak their language. You have a little bit of insight into what they do as a business, which is really important when you're trying to sell the importance of sales in their environment. So, all right, let's get into it.
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
how has selling in the mold making industry changed? And what are the best ways for mold builders to deal with well-informed buyers?
That's a really great question. When, like many industries, the landscape has changed due to some key factors. When you look at the arrival of sales technology, if you look at the onset of artificial intelligence,
Mm,
as well as just the ease that of information on the organization's technology, on the company themselves, the products and services are available, that it's much more at the fingertips of the buyer. And studies have typically shown that about 70% of the buying process has taken place already before they even reach out to do an RFQ. So the challenge with that is that you may, as a business, be ruled out of even having an opportunity to look at a job based on not based on somebody pre-selecting three other
mm,
vendors, let's say. Um, and really, it used to be that you would push the products and services onto prospects and then pull them through the sales process. I still remember going back early into my careers before I went on a trip, I made sure I had like 20 brochures with my business cards stapled to them. So I had those to hand out, those types of things. And really, by the time you get to engage a client, they typically already know that information about you. They've researched you. They've maybe even tried to find some references that could speak to how well it was to work with your organization. So that's really changed that
mm,
quite a bit. Where now the modern sales professional really isn't a seller; they're really somebody that helps people buy. So they
mm,
want to help work them through that process. Which makes it much more of a challenge because traditionally a lot of people relied on cold calling and relationships. And not to say that those are dead, but they're
mhm,
much different now than they used to be. Many times talking with mold builders, and one of the things that they struggle with is they see the ebb and the flow. We're super busy in Q1, but then once we finish that job, we're the floor's dead for a little while. Then we get that spike up again. And a lot of times it's the efforts of the cold calling and the relationships help when you have those relationships. But in terms of trying to generate new business and new awareness, those are the things that you really
mm,
need to look at different. And we'll talk about a little bit about those three key factors. But the fact is relying on cold calling and relationships alone is not something that is repeatable and predictable, which is something that is a requirement to accelerate revenue growth. So really, the three key factors that depend on this are lead generation, predictable lead generation, making sure that your brand is out there for people to find and the value is presented very quickly so they know before they reach out to you that you're one of the people that should be on the short list. Um, Alignment of your sales and marketing strategy. So we talk a lot about how to structure the organization. You're looking at more of the importance of inbound selling,
Mm.
outbound selling, and account management, and how do you structure the organization to successfully do those roles. And that leads into the third part, which is basically structuring the sales process, your systems and requirements. And that's requiring that you have a clear process in place, the roles and responsibilities for clear handoffs between those are established. That way, when you're reaching out to a customer, it is in the most effective and efficient way that really resonates with them.
Wow, that is a lot. It's such an interesting space because I like how you talked about relationships because I also have seen that change dramatically in how they sell. But there's such an interesting blend with their technical knowledge, right? What they need to sell about themselves and what they provide and that relationship building. I
Mhm.
like how you explained that. So in a nutshell, then, this is all leading up to training. So what is a good guide or how important is the right training guide for the varying levels of experience you have with the people that are going to be selling within a mold shop?
It's extremely important because you have to make sure that you're balancing between the appropriate level of technical capability and also the required level of professionalism. And sometimes that does get missed a little bit on the sales side of it.
Hmm.
Just like you would look at going through apprenticeship programs to hone your skills, become a professional mold maker, a lot of the things that are required. A lot of those things are really it's an art form to build a tool. Trust me, I can't
Right.
hold a tolerance to save my life. But at the same token, too, is when you look at the sales profession, it is much an art of that as well. And it's really trying to balance those things through so that way you have the right roles, learning the right type of topics, but also that they engage properly. Sometimes if you're too technical, it gets very transactional. So you get a lot of the information you
Hmm.
need to do the job at hand, but you don't really get as much of the information that's going to allow you to understand, is this the right piece of business for us? What is the timing that this business? So how should we prioritize this in our shop? It's great that it's a $2 million opportunity, but they're not planning to buy till the fourth quarter of the next year. So it's really trying to help understand those, and it really does, depending on how you look at the varying levels.
Hmm.
You want to make sure that it's you're resonating and you're teaching the right bits of information at the right time. And they do have studies that show that less than 10% of employees know how their actions contribute to revenue goals and things like that. And you also want to use that training to help speed up the onboarding process and also ensure that your sales team is selling the way that you want them to. So you look at varying levels. You may have a very experienced salesperson that has joined the organization and they're a great sales professional, but did they come from the automotive industry and you're primarily medical? So they may not know what the discussions, the timelines look like that vary and different. So you want to make sure that they're at least aware of the way that you want to sell. And really the best way to do that is to break that down into 30, 60, 90-day plans and
Okay.
then focus them based on the things that they need to learn first. So if you have somebody that's early to their new career in sales, or in some cases, maybe they're transitioning from a more technical project role to be more customer facing. Maybe you want to start with things like process training. These are the documents that we use. These are how deals flow through our organization. These are the tools like CRM, the type of sales technologies that need to be used, and how those things work through that process. So that way they fundamentally understand what are the rules of engagement for me to
Hmm.
be able to work this process. Then you get into a little bit more of knowing your buyer personas, really what are your ideal customer profiles and how do you relate to them? And where that comes in very handy is things like objection handling or how to work with a different demographic, because you may be working with a client that you're talking to the quality person that is really wants the highest quality. You're talking to a finance person that's like, well, I want great quality, but I want it less expensive. So you need to know how to almost navigate their process internally. So you almost become like a counselor or negotiator
Mm.
between them to get them to move forward. Then you can move to product training technologies and services and stuff like that. And it's really because if somebody doesn't know what the process is, then if they bring a deal in, they don't know how to navigate that through. If they don't know the buyer personas and the type of work you actually want, do they end up in fact bringing you a bunch of work you don't want and you can be profitable on? And helping them understand like how do we win deals? What types of work are we profitable and do we typically win? Then you look at more of a seasoned professional. Usually that's going to be somebody that you really just want to try to reinforce. These are the types of clients we want you to be bringing in, because 90% of the time we win an opportunity when this happens or the customer
Mm.
fits this profile. So that way they're focusing their time more on opportunities that you can secure versus just bringing you an RFQ mill, if you will. Then typically you can have somebody like that look at higher level sales things like creating regional account plans, a customer account growth plans if they're assigned key accounts, because they should be able to start to build and develop those out versus somebody that's a little bit newer. And then in those cases too, is if they're a little bit more seasoned, you can look at having them involved in early stage customer calls, to be able to actually either contribute or understand how that discovery process works.
Wow. It's interesting that you bring up the relationships with the customer and expectations. I know there's the age-old thing where salespeople tend to overpromise, right? So do you have anything to say about, I guess we'll call them misunderstandings between the salespeople and then the actual production teams that have to do the work of what the salesperson sold? Like, what are some challenges there or some advice or how to avoid those misunderstandings?
Yeah, and a lot of that does come with the early stage training where you start looking at identifying the types of customers that you are most likely to be successful with. And then what are the requirements and in what took place when you won that opportunity? We typically need this level of information for us to properly quote a job is a big one that I see. So a lot of times what you end up seeing is you get this where somebody from sales might bring in an opportunity and then but they didn't collect all the information that engineering or product engineering needs to be able to quote the job. So now it becomes this back and forth between, well, it's taking me too long to quote, I need this information, I need
Yeah.
that. And so it makes it a big challenge because you're not getting the right information up front to be able to do that. So really that's in that onboarding and that early stage training, or what we call sales enablement, is
Okay.
creating those by basically saying this, and you don't want to build scripts so that way they're robotic, but you want to basically say, here's 80% of what I need you to do. Use your sales acumen to complete the second
Hmm.
20%, how you deliver it, what your tone is, and those types of things, and how you strategically work somebody through that. And you can build things like these are the requirements that we absolutely need to know to quote on a job. That might even be
Hmm.
started off by these are the types of things that we want our customers, like we want somebody that does this level, like a certain dollar of revenue a year, or it has to be more than a four tool package because we can't do onesie twosies, or
Right.
we have to be working on somebody that has an appetite for X dollars or above because we're not the prototype shop, we're not doing aluminum tooling, we can't do those types of things. So early stage defining what a customer is, then what those requirements are, allows it to be able to be transferred over to engineering at that point, and they have everything that they need to either be able to look at performing their activity Or then you have the ability to now collectively bring them into the customer conversation to talk about more of the specific details in terms of what the requirements are that really need to be handled at a little bit more of a technical level. But it really does boil down into to defining those things up front. And what that's going to help you also do is take a pulse on the health of your sales process.
Mm,
I use quoting of that as a lot of time. A lot of times when you look at people talk, say it takes too long to get quotes done. Well, why is that?
yeah.
It could be that the salespeople aren't getting enough information, and are they not bringing enough information because they're not trained properly, or is it a resource allocation issue? We have way too many ideal jobs coming in, and we really can't. We only have one guy or girl that does the quoting, and there's a log jam there, which if you don't have those measures and structured process, you just know it's taken too long to get quotes done. You don't know why, so you don't know how to fix it. So your car doesn't start, you don't know why, but you can't figure out how to get it to start.
Right. Oh, so that's leads right to metrics. That's kind of what you're talking about. Like how do you know if how you're training and all these sales guides are actually good? Like, yeah, talk a little bit more about other metrics that they should be looking out for.
Yeah, and usually these are going to be higher level metrics. You're going to want to look at things that have an impact on cost savings. So, how much time is like when you look at your sales team, how much time is spent on less time on non-selling activities? So, they're not doing data entry, they're not doing a
Mm,
lot of the things that keep them from selling, which generally speaking, they say salespeople on average sell probably 30% of their time because they have all these other administrative things. So you start to see how that gets reduced, and that you'll see how that gets reduced by seeing the performance enhancement when you have measures in place with how many leads is the company generating, how many of those leads get turned to opportunities, how many of those opportunities get turned to quotes. I could
mm.
go on the list, but I think you know where I'm going with it.
Yeah.
So you look at time spent on non-selling activities. You look at how you get they call it velocity rate, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Mm,
The other thing you can look at is reduced training time. Understanding the opportunity cost of having one of your subject matter experts have to sit down and train with a new salesperson. If you're pulling your best tool design resource off his computer to help train a salesperson on what they need to know. First of all, they're only going to get the perspective of that one person, but also what's that person doing? He's not doing his job, his or her
true.
job. So you look at reduced training time. The other one that's key is look at employee turnover costs. How often are your employees leaving from a sales perspective because they're frustrated? Generally speaking,
Mm,
this is probably dated information, but it used to be about the average salesperson stayed in a role about 18 months and the average sales manager about 24.
okay.
In many cases, a lot of times it's because there's a lot of that lack of training and the sales enablement support. Secondly, is looking at the impact on revenue acceleration, like we just talked about. So, looking at lead velocity, how quickly are your leads turning to opportunities and then turning into quotes? How many of the reach outs that and targets that you're supplying to your sales team are actually resulting in things like discovery calls? Sales effectiveness is a big one. What win rates, time to quota attainment, how long it actually takes to close an opportunity. And that's where we talk a lot about stage to stage metrics, which requires having a lot of what we refer to as qualifying exit criteria to move from stage to stage, is really understanding how quickly are things getting to the quote stage and then how quickly are they moving. Because what you may find out is that things are sitting in the pipeline too long because the lack of understanding of how to drive them forward,
Mm,
especially in something that has such a long sales cycle like we deal with in our industry. It's a lot of phone calls and following up, and you always have to add value to your follow up. So long gone are the days where you're just going to call and say, "Hey, just checking in. Did you see the quote? Yeah, I saw it. Okay, I'll check in another week." So being able to try to do those, and then the last one I would say is you'd start to see an increase in average deal size because
mm,
you've really set expectation in your training of the type of companies that you want to be working with.
Being clear. I love that. Defining it before you even start. Right? Who do you want your customer to be? And what are we capable of? And defining that. Who is, if you could pick one barrier of a typical small, mid-sized mold shop to taking on a process like that, what is that barrier?
I think a lot of times it's not knowing where to start. And many times that's where we'll work with organizations initially on just to talk about let's just talk about where you're at today. Um, and understand where to start is a big one. And it's also, a lot of times there's this misconception that we need this arduous team or
Yep.
we need this large amount of resources or this huge system. And really, it boils down to being able to understand what your goals and vision and objectives are, and then being able to establish the right technology and the right resources to get done in, the again, breaking it down into maybe it's a little bit longer than 30, 60, 90 days, but it's saying, just because you establish 10 things that you need to work on doesn't mean you need to work on all 10. What are
Mhm.
the first three that will have the quickest return impact on the business, whether that be visibility of data, whether that be increased revenue or lead generation. Really, that's really what's going to help with that because the biggest obstacle is you're trying to understand what to do and where to start. And it's like you're starting from a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah.
So it's, telling somebody to draw something and you tell them exactly what you want them to draw, but not giving them a reference of where to start. That's what I find the biggest thing is. And many times it's really just, and we do this as like we call it a sales process audit, is sometimes what we'll do is we'll come in and we'll just talk about what the challenges are and what your goals are. And then do sort of an internal assessment about how you're structured, what the process is, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right, wrong, or indifferent. It just is what it is. And then we can provide a recommendation to say, look, really, if you simply built out these three Excel dashboards that allow you to simply know how things are moving through your
Hmm.
sales process, that might be good enough for right now. Then you build upon it. I think a lot of times people try to get this mindset where like, oh, and here's funny hearing me say this, but oh, we need a CRM. And it's like, well, do you need a CRM or do you just need to be aware of the work that is being done right now so that way
Interesting.
you can actually understand what is the best CRM? And that could be Salesforce, HubSpot. I've worked with people on Smart Sheets, which is basically Excel on steroids,
Hmm.
to be able to what's the right solution. But generally speaking, it's trying to know where to start. And a lot of times there's not that experience or perspective of how things are done other places. And that's really where we bring value is because we bring knowledge and information and experiences from a litany of other industries. But because I've had to live the life of a lot of the people that I talked to early in my career, I can help translate that into what would be workable for them.
Nice. All right. Last but not least, in your experience, who should be, and then who do you see championing this within a mold shop? Who is that person or that team?
It's a good question. I mean,
Hmm.
a lot of times when you look at, and I'll make a generalization, when you look at generally the size of the organizations, it's really, I've found it's going to be two people. In smaller organizations, it might, and I mean by head count, not by size of revenue and capacity, but in size of head count, it's generally starts from the top down, from the ownership's perspective, to be able to look at saying, okay, setting the vision of the things that we need to accomplish and how we need to do that. A lot of that is set from there down, and then they'll look at resources internally or externally that they have to be able to help support that initiative. In some cases, you may look at it as at the senior, either operational if they're responsible for sales operations, or somebody that's responsible for revenue growth, that they'll champion that by understanding that the need for a focus on what I refer to as sales operations.
Okay.
And they'll either champion that internally by finding a resource to help, whether it be external or internal, again, is finding somebody to be able to help champion to bring those ideas to the leadership team to try to help navigate and drive those conversations.
I love it. Well, Keith, that is a lot of information, a lot of good tidbits, and actually some takeaways, some good action items for people listening to get going and to reach out to you. And for everybody out there, we do have an article coming up in, I guess, in a couple months. About this, that you drill down a little bit deeper into some of these details. So be on the lookout for that. I'll link to that article in the show notes. And again, thank you, Keith, for your time. And to everybody watching, remember for everything mold making, visit moldmakingtechnology.com.